Hello everybody and welcome to a very fascinating episode of JTV that's about to take place. We are hosting a debate on an issue that has been swirling around in the news for the last few weeks regarding Israel and the judiciary changes that have been proposed. So for those of you that don't have much of a background into what's been going on, you may have just seen there's these protests in Israel, but you haven't looked into the details. Let me give you a 1-minute summary before we launch into our debate on the matter. So the newly elected government in Israel is proposing changes to the justice system that would shift power from the judiciary to the legislature. And this includes limiting the Supreme Court's ability to veto laws and decisions and give the parliament the power to veto Supreme Court decisions. And the changes are part of a long-standing debate that's been going on for a few decades now in Israel about the role of Israel's Supreme Court in Israeli politics. Now, the current governing coalition, which is made up of right-wing and religious parties, has said that the changes are needed to balance democracy. Their claim is that the Supreme Court and other parts of the legal system are obviously unelected and their decision-making has been somewhat biased. And their proposals are trying to rectify that, whereas critics from all sides of the political spectrum, and I really do mean all sides of the political spectrum, including former prime ministers, former presidents, and leaders of opposition parties, are saying that the changes will threaten individual and minority rights. And there have been huge protests against these reforms that have been occurring across Israel. And the government's plan is, at the moment, to pass the legislation in March. And we thought the best way to really flesh out this issue and understand what's really going on would be to have a debate by someone that supports the changes and someone that is critical of them. So before I introduce our two guests, let me tell you what the motion for today's debate is going to be. It's going to be the proposed reforms. The motion is that the proposed reforms to Israel's judiciary present an existential threat to Israel's democracy and economy. Joining us in favour of the motion is Ian Lucas. He's a critic of the proposed reforms. Ian is a South African activist and historian for Israel, and as the son of the South African Habonim of the 1960s, he's always been involved in Israel's story and has served in the IDF, lived on a kibbutz for 16 years, and has been a long-time educator on Israeli history. Then speaking against the motion, an advocate of the proposed judicial reforms, we have Moshe Koppel. Moshe is an American-Israeli computer scientist, Talmud scholar, and political activist. He founded the Kohelet Policy Forum, which is an Israel-based conservative libertarian think tank that has played a significant role in influencing Israel's lawmakers. Now, the format is going to be very straightforward. I'm not going to be so involved. We're going to have 7 minutes opening statements, 5-minute rebuttals, and then 3 minutes closing statements on either side. So I will, for our speakers, Ian and Moshe, I will let you know when you've got 30 seconds left and need to wrap up. We're going to begin with the proposer of the motion. Again, the title being "The Proposed Reforms to Israel's Judiciary Present an Existential Threat to Israel's Democracy and Economy." And that will be Ian Lucas. Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me state at the outset that there's no question concerning the validity of the outcome of the election. And I unequivocally recognize the coalition as the legitimate elected government of Israel. But for the purpose of the debate, I'd like to concentrate my comments on two essential issues. Namely, how the dismantling of the independent judiciary will undoubtedly, as has been stated by people much smarter than I, will change the nature of Israeli society forever. Once these proposals have been enacted as laws, they can't be reversed. Now, it's not by chance that week after week, tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets to express their concern. Now, these are not just folks from the left or Haaretz readers. They cross the spectrum from every sector of Israeli society. I will then move on to the damage which these reforms will cause to the economy. This has already begun and already underway. Now, we have heard over and over, day in, day out, that the people have spoken. And according to the coalition, democracy is fundamentally about the will of the people. So what's all the fuss about? The people have spoken, you accept the election results. What's the noise about? Democracy has several components, of which one indeed is a free election, a free and open election. As I said at the outset, there's no question about the legitimacy of the election. However, one cannot exclude various other aspects of the components that make up a democracy. Number one, the protection of human rights. Two, the rule of law. Three, the separation of powers. And four, checks and balances of government power by an independent judiciary. Those are four of many components. Those are four that I'm going to concentrate on, which I think are fundamental. In the limited time available, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the aforementioned topics. Suffice it to say that the Attorney General, Gali Baharav Ma'ira, in responding to the proposals of the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, lays out most succinctly the dangers these proposals create for the country. It's a 112-page document, and her response is in stark contrast to the generalities and the lack of clarity that the reforms which were proposed by the minister put out. It begs the question, really, what the agenda behind the coalition partners, what agenda they have in mind by bulldozing, and it really is bulldozing the speed of these proposals going out. Bear in mind that the government has been in power for 7 weeks, and the Knesset is due to rise in 6 weeks' time. So let me focus on the components I mentioned at the outset. The protection of human rights. Now, this is particularly concerning regarding the occupied territories. It has been stated quite openly by both Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, and Minister of Finance, Smotrich, who is also responsible for settlements in the West Bank, and as an aside, has already clashed on numerous occasions with Defense Minister Gallant. But they maintain quite openly that the policy of eventual annexation of the West Bank will soon be underway, irrespective of what the American administration might demand. Now, we could find ourselves in a very unwelcome type of apartheid, a word bandied about much too often and much too often out of context. And as an ex-South African, I know this from very close up. However, if something looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it probably is a duck. Israel is not an apartheid state, and I say that categorically. But if these reforms are enabled, we will be well on the way on that slippery slope. From as far back as the days of David Ben-Gurion, the concept of live and let live was always forefront at Israeli government policy. Bear in mind that one of the first reforms being discussed or being pushed through is changing the status of military law in the West Bank. Now, once this law becomes de facto and is put in place, it is really an annexation of the territories, because the incorporation of close to 3 million people will demand one of two things. Either the creation of a Bantustan type of apartheid state in area C or B or D or whatever you want to call it, or giving full citizen rights in the state of Israel. The second aspect is the rule of law. Now, this has already brutally been sidelined in an attempt to bypass a previous law preventing a felon from becoming a serving minister. Prime Minister Netanyahu had to sack Aryeh Deri from serving in his cabinet. But he made no attempt, and Netanyahu made no attempt to hide the fact that they would find a way of bringing Deri back into the government. Total disregarding the law. The third point, Western liberal democracies have always taken pride in the separation of powers.
Ian, I'm afraid you're going to need to wrap up now. That's your 7 minutes.
You're kidding me.
I'm serious.
I haven't got to half of it. No, it's not 7 minutes. I'm timing as well. That's 4 minutes and 45 seconds. You counted your part as well. Otherwise we're not.
I didn't count my part as well, but I'll allow. If Moshe consents to this, I'm happy to extend both your time by another 2 minutes.
Sure. Great. I'd like to get to the economy side of things as well.
Okay, so I'll tell you what. We'll extend everyone's time to 10 minutes.
I can cut back on the rebuttal. I don't need 5 minutes for the rebuttal. But you.
It's all right. It's all right. We'll extend the opening remarks for 10 minutes, so you've got another 3 minutes.
Thank you. The separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary have always been a key part of democracy. When those separation of powers are at risk, dictatorship arises very quickly. Now, to insinuate that these reforms are going to make Israel more democratic are just untrue. And by cherry-picking bits and pieces of democracies, examples of the UK, the USA, and parts of Europe, and by cherry-picking parts and not take them as a whole, give a very false picture of what the democracy will look like. Let me get straight on to the economic side. The damage that these reforms will unleash on the country are unimaginable. And it's not by chance that in the press conference responding to the letter by 200 of the leading Israeli economists, Prime Minister Netanyahu could not find one economist to share the platform with him. And in order to refute the comments made in the letter, a point was made about JP Morgan, probably the most important investment bank in the world, that they didn't really agree with all the comments. Within 24 hours, JP Morgan had put out their own comment refuting Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments. Now, I think personally, the greatest threat is when leading CEOs of unicorn companies in Israel have openly stated and have begun moving capital out of Israel in huge numbers, including people like Tom Levin, who went as far as saying that if it carries on the way it's going, he will leave the country. The one thing that economists really need and understand, and which is surprising, that Netanyahu, a previous very successful minister of finance, is stability. The idea that Israel economy, which is incredible at the moment, the cutting edge technology, and I'm right with it with the kind of stuff that I'm involved in, is beyond belief. Instability is the one huge danger the economy can't suffer. So in conclusion, let me finish very quickly. There's a lot more, I would like to have said, but hopefully it'll come in the rest of the discussion. Let me conclude with the words of Nobel Prize laureate Daniel Kahneman, who said in an interview, "These reforms are a greater existential threat to Israel than the Yom Kippur War." Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. And now, against the motion that The proposed reforms to Israel's judiciary present an existential threat to Israel's democracy and economy. We have Moshe Koppel. Moshe, we're going to give you 10 minutes as we extended Ian's time. So when you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, not only do I think that these reforms are not an existential threat to Israel, I think they're absolutely necessary and constructive. I'm a little bit distressed. Sometimes I debate people and they simply assume the conclusion, namely that that these reforms are the end of democracy, that the end of human rights, et cetera, and then they just go on to demagogue us about all the terrible things that that's going to cause us, semi-apartheid, demi-apartheid, people pulling their money out of the country. What I'd like to do in the 10 minutes that I have is actually say what is in the reform and why these elements of the reform are necessary and why they don't do any damage at all. And I would be very happy if in your rebuttal, Ian, you would say which specific aspects of this reform you regard as dangerous. So you mentioned, Ian, that what's very important is to have checks and balances between the different branches of government. And I completely agree that's necessary. The branches of government, of course, being the elected branches, the executive and the legislature, in Israel's case, the Knesset, on the one hand, and the judiciary on the other hand. Now, we understand what the checks and balances are against the elected branches. There's judicial review. They're able to rule that certain laws, regular statutes, are unconstitutional. In Israel's case, is not actually a constitution. There are basic laws that they can rule that certain laws are in conflict with the basic laws. And they can also rule that a particular administrative action or administrative decision is invalid for a number of reasons, because it's prejudicial, because it was done without appropriate authority, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all that is perfectly fine and accepted. But the question is, the reason that we want to have checks and balances on the elected branches is that even elected officials are human beings and they're capable of making big blunders. They're capable of doing horrible things and violating people's human rights, and we want to be able to protect against that. My view, as you said at the beginning, I'm a libertarian. The most important thing for me is human liberty, freedom, and you certainly want the courts to be able to protect the freedom of Israel's citizens. But judges are people too, and judges do crazy things sometimes. And the question is, what checks and balances do the elected branches have on the judiciary? What can you do about the court? Okay, so in the entire world, not just in certain places, but in the entire world, there are three methods that are used in order to balance the court's power. The first one is the process by which judges are selected. So in almost every country, judges are selected by some combination of the legislature and the executive branch. For example, in the United States, they're chosen, the president nominates, and then the Senate has to approve. It's the same way in almost every country. Great Britain is slightly different. They use a panel of experts, no matter. In any event, in England, as you I'm sure know, the judges cannot actually strike down laws. Okay, so just bear that in mind as I go forward. So the first thing is how judges are selected. In Israel, there is a panel of 9. The panel includes 3 sitting justices. Okay, now, since you need 7 to appoint a Supreme Court justice, that means that sitting justices have an effective veto on who gets appointed to the court. That, of course, results in a great deal of homogeneity, right? Because they will veto anybody who's not sufficiently similar to what they already are. So that kind of homogeneity is unhealthy. Now let's move on to the second type of balance, checks and balances that you have on the courts. The courts are unable to hear any case that they wish. There are 2 limitations. First of all, a person can only bring a petition to the court if they have been concretely and directly affected by something, and they say, I seek remedy from the court. So that's called standing, and there are limitations on standing everywhere. And also there are limitations on justiciability. There are certain kinds of cases that the court will not hear because they involve things like war and peace and foreign policy and such, which are given to the elected branches, right? They're not justiciable because if the judges were to get involved, they'd be replacing the judgment of elected officials with their own judgment, and that's not their job. Now, with regard to the second one, Israel does not have any limitations on standing or justiciability. It's the only country in the world that has no limitations on standing and justiciability. As Aaron Barak said, Hakol Shafit, they will listen to petitions on any topic, including war and peace, as Barak specifically said, and everybody has standing. Anybody who doesn't like some government policy can come to the court. Okay, so that's another kind of checks and balances that the whole world has that Israel does not have. And the third thing is that there are only certain tools that the court has in order to strike down government actions or laws. So, for example, you can only say that a law is invalid if it is against the Constitution, right? Now, in the UK, you can't do that at all. Judges can't strike down laws. They can simply note that they regard this law as being unconstitutional, but they can't actually strike it down. Now, and with regard to government actions or government decisions, right? So these are administrative decisions, not laws. The court can come and say, well, it's prejudicial or whatever, but they can't. They could say it violates somebody's human rights. They could say it was taken without authority. What they cannot do is just say we find it unreasonable and we disagree with it. That's everywhere in the world. In Israel, that limitation too is gone. In Israel, the court can say we regard that as unreasonable, and therefore it's invalid. They don't have to say it's illegal, it was done without authority. Okay. Now, in addition, with regard to laws, the judges have now said that they can use basic laws. They said this 25 years ago, they can use basic laws to strike down regular statutes, but now they said they can even strike down basic laws. That is, they can rule that the Constitution is unconstitutional based on certain principles of democracy that they have in their head. Okay. In addition to all this, so the short version is there are no checks and balances on the court. The court has essentially absolute power in Israel. In addition to that, the court ruled that the Attorney General, who's just an official who was appointed by the government, can actually tell the government what to do. The government is bound by, including the Prime Minister, is bound by the Attorney General. So if you want to put all this together, when the court says that the government is bound by the Attorney General and anything that they regard as unreasonable is by definition illegal, they've essentially told the Attorney General that anything he finds unreasonable, he can tell the government they can't do. So let me give you an example of this, just so you can appreciate how crazy this can get. The Justice Minister, Amir Ohana, in 2019, wanted to appoint a chief prosecutor because the previous chief prosecutor's term had ended. The law says very clearly that it's the attorney, that it is the authority of the Justice Minister to appoint the chief prosecutor. So the Justice Minister was about to appoint the chief prosecutor, and the Attorney General of the state, Avichai Mandelblit, came and said to him, well, I don't know who you're going to appoint, but it doesn't matter because it would be unreasonable, in my opinion, to appoint anybody but one specific person named Momi Lemberger. If you appoint anybody else, I regard that as unreasonable. I'm your boss because the court said I'm your boss, and the court said that anything unreasonable is illegal. And therefore, right, if you were thinking that unreasonable means like crazy things like Caligula appointing his horse to be consul, no. It turns out that it is now the Attorney General can tell the Justice Minister, who has full authority over a particular appointment, that you have to appoint this person or else I would regard it as unreasonable. Okay, so this is where we've gotten. The purpose of these reforms is simply to put some checks and balances on the court. So specifically, there's the panel of 9 that appoints judges. Instead of the judges having a veto on who gets appointed, they simply want to change the composition of the panel slightly so that the judges wouldn't have a veto. Okay, instead of the judges being able to say that something is unreasonable, they'd have to explain why it's illegal or why it was done without authority.
20 seconds.
Okay, they can't strike down basic laws because that's the Constitution. Okay, these are the kinds of the Attorney General can't boss the government around. He can only explain the law to them and advise them how to act. But his rulings are not binding on the government. They're only advice, just as they are in the UK, where the Attorney General is the Justice Minister and is part of the government. Okay, so all of the changes made are minor changes, just trying to put basic checks and balances on the court.
Thank you very much, Moshe, for your opening remarks. Ian, you now have 5 minutes for a rebuttal. I will let you know when you have 20 seconds left, when you're ready.
Right, thank you. I was a little bit disappointed with your opening comment about demagoguery. And let's get to the tachlis of the stuff. I don't think you can deny the fact that money's been moving out the country. I don't think you can deny that these minor changes, as you call them, are not minor changes at all. The first thing they do is they give absolute power to the government. By a margin of 61 votes in the Knesset, the government can do what it likes, even to the extent of saying you're not going to have an election in 4 years, you're going to have it in 10 years. By one vote. That's not a check and balance. Now, there's no doubt that the judiciary required change. I'll be the first one to agree with you. Aaron Barak in 95 had gone too far. The interesting thing is that in all the period of time since then, the person who's been in power the longest, Prime Minister Netanyahu, didn't have a hell of a lot to say about the judiciary at the time. Interesting about demagoguery, if you want to go down that road, when you talk about the Attorney General Mandelblit, Mandelblit was an appointee of Netanyahu and very close to Netanyahu. Mandelblit is a classic example of how an independent judiciary should work. Because as an appointee of Netanyahu, he was the guy who brought the charges against Netanyahu. And now all hell's broken loose, but that's a different story. You asked me to give you one or two examples of where I thought the laws had gone too far. The first one is the appointment of legal advisors to ministers. These are little things that are coming, and most people don't even know about. Up until now, every ministry has a legal advisor appointed by the Attorney General, appointed by the Judiciary, who is beholden to the Attorney General, not to the minister. One of your proposals is that ministers will appoint their own legal advisors, which means that that individual is beholden to the minister, becomes a yes man. There's a great British program called Yes Minister. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's worthwhile looking at because that's a classic of what you're talking about. Now, another example is the override law. Any law can be overridden once again by a majority of one in the Knesset. Now, with the idea that the people have spoken and the Knesset has a majority of 64 to 56, anything the government wants to do will be done. That's not demagoguery, that's fact. The same way as that, I don't think you can not account for the fact that hundreds of thousands of people across the spectrum, and I know people from Efrat, for example, who were at the protest on Saturday night. So the idea that your judiciary needs to be reined in, I agree with you. I agree there needs to be balance. But the balance has to come from an independent judiciary, which means the Attorney General, although appointed by the Prime Minister, is not beholden to the Prime Minister. That judges, and here's the second example, you talk about the appointment of how judges are appointed. There are two things that I fundamentally disagree with you here. Number one, in the appointment of judges. There is no doubt that one has to know how to be a judge. It's all well and good to be a lawyer, but how does the judicial process work? And people in the committee, judges, are the best people to know about that. That they should have a veto or have an overriding decision, I agree with you, is not right. There needs to be a consensus somewhere along the line. And I've always believed in consensus, not perfect consensus, but agreement. And democracy and law is about protecting the minority. Not only freedom across the board. Protecting minorities are a very crucial part of what an independent judiciary should be doing and is doing and has been doing. So there are numerous things that are going. One other example, just to end off and then I'll end.
Ian, I was going to say, I'm going to make an executive decision to add 1 minute to either side, because I think it's probably proportionate to the length of discussion. Okay.
Where these laws are coming through at this tsunami pace, out of the blue, suddenly something comes up like a proposal to change the dress code for women at the Koppel. In other words, women coming to the Koppel had to be dressed according to Orthodox dress code. When that was put forward, immediately Netanyahu had to step in and draw back. And what happened? They interviewed some young women at the Koppel who were dressed in jeans and, sleeved blouses, obviously, very nicely dressed. And one of the women said, well, the women and girls, she was about 19, 20. I voted for Ben Gvir. I served in Tzahal. I served in the IDF. I love coming to the Koppel. This is where I believe I should be able to come. But no one, and as a libertarian, I think you should find this even more astounding. No one should be able to tell me what I can or what I can't wear when I come to the Koppel. Obviously, I'm not going to come in a bikini or that kind of stuff. But that's where these reforms, supposedly minor reforms, as you call them, are huge and are hugely damaging. Thanks.
Great. Okay, Moshe, we're going to give you the same amount of time as Ian's, 6.5 minutes to respond.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, the example of that proposal about the dress code at the Kotel, on the contrary, that exactly proves that you don't need judicial intervention in order to prevent this kind of madness. Okay, somebody brings up a crazy law, immediately it's very unpopular, and the prime minister has to step in and say, we're not going to do this. You don't need the judiciary to do that. When politicians do something that's immensely unpopular, it gets shut down very, very quickly. Okay, now, with regard to the idea that legal advisors need to be chosen by somebody other than the minister, because God forbid, if the minister chooses his own lawyer, who knows what's going to happen? Well, first of all, I'm sure that you choose your own lawyer, as every executive in the world chooses their own lawyer. And by the way, in the UK, the law officers, the attorney general and the solicitor general, whose task is exactly what you described, are not only chosen by the government, they actually sit in the government, okay? So they're not over the government, and they can be fired at the discretion of the prime minister, all right? So I don't know where there's another country in the world, and you can't give me an example because there are none, okay, where it's necessary for somebody, some outside force, to assign lawyers to ministers who are supposed to guard over them. There's no such thing. We only have it in Israel, and it really needs to stop. It's absurd. Who are these people? Who gave them their authority? Who voted for them? Who chose them? Nobody. Okay. It is the ministers who have been elected, and they're the ones who need to make decisions, make their own legal decisions. If they make legal decisions that are incorrect, then you can take them to court, and the court can overrule them. All right. Now, your claim is that the court is always expanding people's human rights. They're always protecting people's liberties. That is not the case. Okay, let me explain something. When there's always going to be some process, right? There's some flow chart where somebody makes the initial decision, then somebody after that makes the next decision, and there's somebody at the end of that line. All right, it might be the court, it might be the Knesset, it might be the government, it might be the Sultan of Brunei. Okay, I have no idea who it's going to be. All right, but whoever it's going to be, that person who gets the last word can always make awful decisions. And you're going to say, wait a minute, what if that person makes awful decisions? We need somebody after them. Okay, that's just going to lead to infinite regress. So the argument here about who should have the last word, should it be the court or should the Knesset have an override? Well, that's just the question about who's going to be at the end of this line. It's going to be somebody, and that somebody can do horrible things. Now, you may say to me, no, the court's never going to do horrible things because, well, because courts never do horrible things, or because, well, maybe the court, the judges kind of look like me, so I kind of trust them. But who knows who these Shas guys are? They don't look like me. So first of all, that's a bad way to decide procedures. Procedures need to be decided from behind the veil of ignorance, where you don't know who the judges are going to be, you don't know who the members of Knesset are going to be, and it's only behind the veil of ignorance that you can actually make these kinds of decisions, okay, about who should get the power, all right? So don't make that decision based on whom you identify with. In 10 years from now, you may identify more with the Knesset than you do with the judges. But let me just give you one example of where the court did the exact opposite of extending liberties, all right? There was a case last year, I happened to have been, Kohelet happened to have been one of the petitioners. The question is whether a college, a private college, that wants to have classes that are gender separated for men and women for Haredim, because they want to encourage Haredim to study in college, right? And we're talking about Haredim who wish to sit separately, so that there's no coercion involved. Both sides are doing this willingly. The colleges because they want to encourage the Haredim to study, the Haredim because they wish to, okay? Now, this case went to court, right? I was petitioning to broaden the possibility of this. Now, there's a law that says that you can have gender separation in universities and colleges for religious reasons. That's a clear law. Nevertheless, the court ruled that because we have the human dignity basic law, which is above any other law, and because they read into it equality, and because you can't have separate but equal, therefore, if you have separate classes, they're inherently unequal, and this violates a basic law, and that overrules the regular law that says that there's a religious exemption, okay? So the end result was that the court now limited the rights of Haredim who wished to take these classes. It limited the rights of the universities who wished to give these classes, okay, all in the name of some abstract version of equality, okay? And bear in mind that once the court said that the basic law beats the regular law that for the religious exemption, understand that in principle now, the court can say that yeshivot can't be gender separated, that schools, synagogues can't be gender separated. Okay, we're now at the point where the court has already given itself the authority to say that Orthodox people who wish to daven with a mechitza, theoretically, the court could strike that down. Okay, that is certainly a basic right. That is a violation of religious freedom, and the court has not yet done it. They've only done it with regard to college courses, but they have very clearly established the principle that they could do it. So I bring this example to make clear to you that the court is not always on the side of human liberty. Let's leave it at that.
Okay, great. Well, we're now going to move to the final remarks. I encourage you, if there's any final points you want to pick up in response to one another, you can use that in this time now, and any final comments you wish to make. I'm going to make based on how timings are slightly adjusted, I'm going to learn from that and give you both 5 minutes for your closing statements to respond and summarize what you want to say.
But that's perfect. I won't use all the 5 minutes because.
Okay, so Ian, I'll start the time. I'll start the timer now. Go for it. I'll start the timer now. Go for it.
Okay. My final comment really is about what I'm hearing is popularism. The majority will decide what's good and what isn't good. The examples that you give, the drill down example, for example, of the yeshivot and the separation, in the same flip side of that is one of the first laws or changes that went through was revoking the tax on plastic crockery and cutlery, one-time use of stuff, which had been brought in as a hugely, hugely important climate change issue that Israel wanted to be part of. A very narrow agenda of the Haredi parties, because, and I understand that, the Haredi communities use disposable plates and cutlery very often. And it hit the pocket of Haredi families badly. So where do you draw the line? What is the agenda of each of the coalition parties? And I think that the Coherent Policy Forum is being a little disingenuous in not declaring who funds the forum and where this think tank is based and where it's all coming from. I've never heard that, and I've looked for it. I think there is an agenda of a very narrow agenda. And I honestly didn't like the comment about, I don't like Shas. Like some of my best friends are in Shas kind of argument. I heard that in South Africa many, many times. I don't buy that argument. The focus is very much around, is an independent judiciary critical to the ongoing democracy that Israel has standing in the world? When Alan Dershowitz has to get up and say that he would not be able to defend Israel in the International Court of Law, alarm bells should be ringing everywhere. It's not by chance that Dershowitz was interviewed 2 or 3 nights ago and could possibly be the go-between, not President Herzog, between the two different worlds that are coming together here. My fear is that neither side sees itself as being wrong. And I don't think either side is wrong. There are arguments on both sides that are very, very important. But where both sides see there's no room for compromise, and the opposition parties say, we can't compromise because this is democracy. How can you compromise on democracy? The coalition parties say, we were elected by the will of the people. We're only doing what we were voted in to do. So this clash of I'm right and you are wrong must change. There must be some kind of, I think, slowdown. Number one, I think the tsunami of pace of these reforms is where the real danger is, in my estimation. I think people sitting around a table. And again, it wasn't by chance that Naftali Bennett, former prime minister, was also interviewed. He's been very quiet over the last few months, strangely enough, has said that he is absolutely convinced that by sitting around a table and finding some kind of middle path and slowly bring around reforms which are needed, I think that's what the country needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Moshe, your final remarks. You've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, I don't need 5 minutes, and I don't have 5 minutes because I've been spending the last month doing nothing but speaking to people who are opposed to these proposals and trying to hammer out compromises. I do that most of my time every day. I'm right in the middle of a 6-hour discussion with people in the opposition trying to find compromises. I took out a half hour of my time, and they're all summoning me to come back to the meeting in which we're trying to hammer out compromises. I'm quite convinced that we'll be able to do so. I apologize that I'm short, but I actually have to run back to that very meeting.
No problem at all. Well, we wish you much success in your future meetings. And thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to do this. I really, really appreciate it. And our viewers really appreciate it as well.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you.